All right, it's Pipes Drums. We're putting together a Teaching Teachers segment. We're in part one right now, and really pleased to have four of the world's most prominent and successful teachers. We've got Margaret Dunn coming from Glasgow as a teacher with the National Piping Center. Nick Hudson, piper from Houston, Texas, originally from Pittsburgh, but he works with St. Thomas Episcopal School in Houston. Jim McGillivray, a very prominent teacher, has written a lot of manuals and things for pupils. His rhythmic fingerwork and rhythmic pibroch or pibroch fingerwork been very successful, but he's been a teacher for a long time with St. Andrew's College in Aurora. And Mick O'Neill, he's coming to us from Bo'ness, Scotland. He is a teacher with George Watson's College in Edinburgh. So thanks very much, everybody, for taking the time to get together with us. So, just thought, we talk about the pandemic in the last 18 months and, really looking at the past and if there are things that we can take away that you've taken away from the last 18 months. And maybe we'll start with you, Jim. As a teacher, what have you learned over the last 18 months when it comes to working with students?
Well, I've certainly learned that, if you're speaking specifically with teaching students online, it's, I know there's a lot of instruction takes place online even during non-pandemic times. I hadn't done a lot of Skype teaching or Zoom teaching before the pandemic, and of course I've done a lot of it now. Excuse me. And certainly my first perception is that teaching on Zoom is second best any way you look at it. But when you've nothing else and no other way to do it, it can be made to work. And we made it work with our boys at St. Andrew's College. A big part of what we missed over the year, because we didn't have our boys, it's a boys' school, we didn't have our boys together. We certainly found it hard to motivate the boys because they didn't have the camaraderie of being together as a unit and as a band, which motivates any band member to learn the tunes and do better. So we certainly missed a big part of that. But we were still able to have boys keep their fingers going and learn tunes. So it was better than I think what some music programs, non-piping music programs, had to do, which was basically shut down completely for 18 months.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mick, in Edinburgh, what about your experience? I mean, you also work at a school. Were you finding the same sorts of issues that Jim talked about?
I think what Jim says very valid. I think what I would say is that the thing that you miss the most is the natural connection of being face to face with an individual, whether it be child or adult. If you're teaching them, teaching is a lot about relationships and making a relationship work with an individual, and it's not so easy to do that through an online situation. So I think probably that was sometimes difficult in terms of motivating the people because you weren't there with them. And as Jim says, the fact that you weren't meeting for band practices and things like that, and also there was no competitive point to try and aim for with the children, it made it certainly more challenging in terms of motivation. But what I would say is some pupils really they really did respond well to it, and it was quite surprising. And sometimes it was the ones that maybe you weren't expecting them to respond as well to the online teaching, and they did, and they tended to progress very well, much more than maybe I would have expected. Had you asked me 6 months before this had happened, well, how do you think A, B, and C will do? Well, C might struggle, I think, but A and B will do well. Well, sometimes it wasn't always the case there. It was the guy that you weren't expecting to do well. So there were definitely a lot of issues with it, but there were definitely some plus points. One of them being that we managed to keep tutoring our charges and getting them to progress. I would say almost all of my pupils progressed to a certain extent, even though we weren't in a face-to-face environment. But certainly the motivational side of it was definitely a challenge, because they, like us, they knew very quickly that the events that we were going to have, the games and things like that, weren't going to happen, and that then obviously has a detrimental effect on their willingness to put the work in out with the lesson.
Yeah, yeah, and that, Margaret, that motivational side of things at the National Piping Centre and your work with pupils probably from around the world, not just in the UK. Were you finding that same kind of challenge?
I think the online competitions were really useful and gave a lot of students something to work towards when all in-person events were off. So that was one way, I think, to keep students motivated when there wasn't anything else going on. And also the piping and drumming qualifications moved online, so you could do your practical exam, and the theory exam now actually can also happen online. So that was another thing that I suggested to some students, maybe as a goal, just to keep them motivated throughout the lockdown.
Yeah, and Nick, with an N, from Houston. Houston is a vibrant city, lots of things going on, maybe not so much during the pandemic, but like Glasgow and Toronto and Edinburgh, lots of distractions. What about your experience without, a time without recitals, parades, and so forth? Was it hard to motivate students?
I think, yeah, in a way, but there was perhaps an upside to like nothing was going on. It wasn't only piping and drumming that was shut down. I think part of the challenges was, with the medium, the online medium, but a lot of the challenges were just motivating, kids in particular when there aren't any, once everything was canceled, once we realized this was going to last a lot longer than, a month or two. So initially, when we first were online, I still felt like there was a lot of motivation. We were still working on kind of band music. And then at a certain point, it's like, oh, well, we won't play anywhere for over a year. Let's kind of change course a little bit. Let's get off this sort of assembly line of just working on band music, which is basically 10 minutes worth of music if you count a medley and an MSR. And just being able to work on other music that, folk are interested in is pretty easy for the solo-oriented players, because there were a lot of solo contests. And for somewhere where in Houston, we're fairly geographically removed from a lot of contests. So it, means a lot of travel. And so that was actually a great thing for a lot of our players, was they were able to go to far more contests, than a regular year. But the challenge would be with the folk that aren't interested in, the solo competition scene, kind of motivating them and finding the things that they're sort of interested, and like throwing a log on that spark, coaxing that interest, trying to find interest that way, rather than just drilling this 10 minutes worth of band music, competition music with no competitions on the horizon.
That's really interesting. At the same time, I mean, all of you are sounding like you're successful motivating pupils to stay with it, but did you see any kind of drop off, considering the kind of challenges, the distractions, the other things going on, or was it more of what Nick was talking about, and actually, ironically, getting people to focus more on piping or drumming? Mick, in Edinburgh, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we didn't see a great deal of drop off. We were very fortunate in that 95% or so of our pupils stayed with it, and post getting back into face-to-face teaching, as we have done for the last term or so, we've managed to retain almost all of our pupils. There's been a natural drop off that there always is, but no more than we would normally expect at that time of the year, coming back after a long summer break. You inevitably lose one or two who've just lost interest in the art form. But what I would say, I would support what Margaret said about the SCQF PDQB studies. We did an exam diet, quite a large one actually at Watson's, of more than 45 pupils sitting different levels of exam, and that was a great way to motivate them. And they were getting a qualification at the end of it, which we would ordinarily do anyway in our yearly plan. We would always have an exam diet in December, and we did it at the same time, but it was all online. So yeah, I found that extremely useful. And I would also agree with what Nick said about the moving away from the standard repertoire was also a great motivator in terms of keeping the pupils going at it and learning different forms of music, historical music that's very famous for being played, the big sets, shots played in the 60s and things like that. I got my kids onto things like that, and just the idea that they were learning something out with what we would normally do. I think that was a great motivator, to be honest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sort of going back and maybe taking some time and a little bit of the history of drumming and piping. Margaret, the National Piping Center teaching is part of the organization's business. Was there a real push? Did you have a marketing effort behind things to keep people attracted, new students, and keep them motivated and keep them from dropping off? Or were you seeing kind of an attrition?
I think that we had a good uptake to lessons because all of our schools, so the seasonal schools, went online, and we actually had never ran a school online before, which looking at it now you think, why didn't we? So all the schools went online and offering time zones that suited other time zones as well, not just UK. And you tend to get lessons or students off of the back of schools because you meet people that maybe wouldn't have normally travelled, made a trip to Glasgow and flights, accommodation, all of that. So they attended our schools probably for the first time online. And and you gain some students off the back of schools as well. So I think that it's been really busy teaching wise for all the teachers at the centre.
Mm-hmm. And Jim and Nick, do you see any kind of waning interest as a result, or were you equally successful keeping people from dropping off?
Interest in continuing to play certainly stayed up, and I was very concerned about this September when we actually came back to school in person at the school, and how we would do with new sign-ups of middle school students, which is really our bread and our entire feeder program. And we had one of the best sign-ups for middle schoolers that we've ever had. If there's one thing that's dropped off, I think the biggest thing is now that we've actually got our pipe band back together again. We've had 18 months. A lot of the younger boys in our band aren't really capable of instrument maintenance yet, and if their pipes quit going on them, there wasn't much they could do, and there wasn't, as teachers, we weren't allowed to address wind instruments. So we're coming back to the band now in September, and it's in pretty rough shape. Kids don't know the tunes. One thing we had a lot of trouble with was getting the students to memorize the tunes, keep learning the repertoire and memorize it, because of course they didn't have to stand at band practice and play it without music. So yeah, the band right now could certainly be better, but I'll be interested to see how long it takes us to get it back into shape.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, sound familiar to you too?
Yeah, certainly the warm-up sets, like the ones that we weren't really drilling in, the lessons. When we got back together, they were like, "Oh yeah, we haven't played these in, quite a while since you're not repping through them at a band practice." One of the benefits, though, honestly, with the online thing and just a lack of things happening was the ability to be a little bit more consistent with students outside of school. Just not having weekend trips, contests, things like that sort of break it up. And the ability to actually be somewhere else, be on even a vacation, and touch base with somebody. I actually ended up, if you just count hours, ended up teaching more during the pandemic than I would in a typical year.
That's really interesting. Well, when we wrap up part one here, we've talked about the past. We'll talk about what's going on right now a little bit more. So let's stay tuned for that.